problem of causation is a very difficult one. It's an unsolved one, because when we say, well, one thing causes another, we sort of intuitively understand that. But what is the essence of causation? We don't know that. And the reason we don't know that is that it's not there.
In other words, in this non-dual mode, you do not perceive that phenomena are caused by other phenomena from another moment previous, but rather that all phenomena are arising as a direct expression of the absolute with this spontaneous immediacy, uncaused.
We now run a weekly membership program with Bernardo Kastrup that you can join at withrealityinmind.com. This includes weekly Q&As, special guests like Rupert Spira, Michael Levin, Federico Fagin. There's an international, vibrant community of researchers, academics, meditators, mystics, philosophers, poets, creatives, musicians, anyone that wants to deeply understand this philosophy and its potential implications for their lives. Tonight we have Bernardo here with guest Christopher Wallis, aka Hareesh. Hello, Bernardo.
Hi, Amir.
How you doing?
Good. Yourself?
Yeah, really good. Excited for tonight. Also
Cool.
a little sad that it's the last one of this series. Hopefully we'll do more, but
there will be another one soon enough.
Well, I was mentioned to Bernardo already that we thought perhaps you could, as you said, present some ideas, maybe taking 10 minutes to give us some kind of overview of the perspectives from your tradition about various aspects of reality, and then check in with Bernardo if to what extent it matches his model. And then we've got lots of prepared questions, and I'm sure more will come from the chat. Hareesh, let's not waste any of your precious time.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'll just give a little overview. This is different from what I did last time, and more to the point in terms of the view of the nature of reality in non-dual Shaiva Tantra, also known as Kashmir Shaivism, also known as Tantric Shaivism, has various names. And in this kind of spiritual religious complex, there flourished some philosophers who, in a way, deviated from the mainstream of this spiritual religious tradition. And these philosophers, you could almost describe them as atheistic, because they presented a view which is so distant in many ways from any form of traditional theology, either Western or Eastern or Indian. So from the point of view of their own tradition, it's like they almost committed the sin of of articulating an atheistic view, because there's no personhood attributed to God or supreme consciousness. There's no personhood, and there's no intentionality other than the will to become everything as it appears, right? Meaning to say there's no plan for existence in the mind of a supreme being. So that was, it's kind of a radical departure for these philosophers that were nevertheless embedded in this traditional context that they kind of challenged and had to be careful not to challenge too much. So almost similar to Meister Eckhart in the Christian tradition. He had a view about the ground of being and the Godhead, and how, and he had to be careful not to, but in the Indian context, there was no risk of being burned at the stake, as there was for Meister Eckhart, but still, there's that pressure to craft the message in a way that's not too radical. So based on these philosophers that I'm speaking of, people like Utpaladeva and Abhinavagupta, this is the picture of things. If I can just summarize it in simple language, we speak of first order and second order reality, where first order reality is things as they are in themselves, and that and this may be a difference with Bernardo's view, that there's an assertion that through spiritual enlightenment, it's possible to experience things as they are in themselves, but almost nobody does, most people experience, is second order reality. And that is reality as fully mediated in every moment by our interpretations, mental constructs, cultural constructs, et cetera, et cetera. And so we could loosely define first order reality as that which is before we have a thought about it, before we have an interpretation of it. And second order reality is then the interpretations. Or to put it another way, first order reality is that which presents prior to interpretation, and interpretation is the representation, the representation, right? So then there's this assertion, as I mentioned, that through a very sometimes arduous process of radically deconstructing your mental constructs and your cultural constructs, and through meditative practice and awareness cultivation, it's possible to have this breakthrough. And the breakthrough, when it happens, happens very quickly. Even if the kind of integrating the implications of the breakthrough can take a long time. And this breakthrough, which people call enlightenment or awakening or release from the tyranny of ordinary reality, as people see it, allows you to immerse in reality as such. But the problem, of course, is that you can't then say anything about it. So if I describe the experience of this first order reality from my own point of view, there are no objects, even if the visual field has not changed. Nothing has changed from the point of view of the senses, but it's a radically different paradigm in which the mind is not filtering or mediating experience. So in that, without the mind filter, there are no objects, there is no subject. So there's no subject-object dichotomy at all. And all, how do I put it? There are qualia. The qualia of experience are there, but none of them belong to objects, because objects are conceptually constructed. And here there's no concept. So, but all the qualia of experience are there, yet more vivid, more powerful, more raw. And there's, in this state, if we can call it a state, there's nothing that is self or other. So the physical body I usually call mine is no more or no less the body of awareness than all the other phenomena or qualia that are experienced. So if there is a body of awareness, if awareness is embodied, it's embodied not only in this flesh and blood form, but in all appearances whatsoever, in all the qualia. So that's, as soon as I finish, I want to hear from Bernardo if he thinks it's impossible or possible to have this direct experience of reality without mental mediation. Now, I kind of oversimplified the process because the process of landing there, because there is an intermediate stage, because you go about deconstructing all your beliefs and you come to see your beliefs are merely beliefs, they're merely thoughts, they are not reality, they're just partial and usually distorted representations of reality, tiny fragmented, distorted representations. That's what thoughts are and beliefs are. So you go about deconstructing those. But in this tradition that I study, they talk about there's still a deep, subtle level of mental projection. And that's called the Pashyanti level of discourse. So there's these 4 levels of speech or discourse, and this Pashyanti level is this very subtle, deep level where discourse, or we could call it cultural programming, is shaping our experience of reality unknown to us, almost we could say subconsciously, which doesn't require us to reify a subconscious mind. But then there needs to be a deeper excavation of the influence of this Pashyanti level of speech or discourse. And when that is done, then there's this breakthrough. So before the breakthrough, you can think you're having an experience of reality unmediated by thought, because there are no thoughts, there are no conscious thoughts happening. And you're just like, wow, this is cool. But without the thought, you're in the wonder of experience without thinking about it, without interpreting it compulsively. And you might think, oh, I'm there, but you're not, because that deeper level of excavation of the projection of discourse in a very subtle, and we might say almost subconscious way, needs to happen. And then there's this breakthrough that I'm talking about. And from my direct experience, I can say it's real, but I wouldn't be surprised if somebody said, no, it's impossible. You just only, you imagine you're experiencing reality directly as it is in itself, but you couldn't be. I would take issue with that from my personal experience, but I couldn't prove it philosophically or scientifically, So lastly, there's this question of, is there a reality that is unexperienceable by us? It's kind of thinking of how Donald Hoffman talks about it, that all that we see and touch and so on are like the desktop icons, and the deeper reality is just the binary code, right? And we'll never be able to perceive that. Well, in this tradition that I study, and the philosophers of the tradition, they argue there is only formless consciousness, the absolute, mind at large, whatever you want to call it. And then there's the will inherent to that formless consciousness, which is incomprehensible to our minds, perhaps, but it is a will. And here there's an interesting connection, as I think already noted at Essentia Foundation, between Utpaladeva and his cadre and Schopenhauer, where the will is inherent to consciousness, and the will causes all things to appear as they do, with no premeditation, with no conceptual thought on the part of mind at large about, let's do it like this. But there's a pure will, which scholars of this tradition call precognitive will, because it comes before cognition. And the will is to appear in the way that everything appears, right? And so there's the assertion that there isn't any world or universe behind appearances other than formless being itself, whether we call it formless consciousness or formless being, which might be better. Now, having said that, they also acknowledge that everything is really energy, right? That there's only that manifestation, everything in the world of manifestation is in reality energy. Literally means capacity to do work or the capacity to transform. And they had a kind of rudimentary understanding of fields, and so they argue that, even static objects are really just energy, which of course mirrors modern understanding. But the energy, it's not that there's some unseen world behind this world, but that the energy of consciousness manifests in the way that it does because it wants to manifest that way. Anyway, so this is just my attempt to really simplify some very complex discussions in the original Sanskrit, where part of what's going on is they're trying to refute some Buddhist notions, and they're trying to put forth this new view at the time, 1,000 years ago or 1,100 years ago, and this was sometimes called the new and easier path to enlightenment or realization.
This is fantastic, a great overview. I'm not in a position to judge your tradition. Who am I to judge 1,100-year-old tradition? I think what we could try to do is sync up on language, on the words we use, so people understand what each of us means when we use certain words. I am, as far as I can understand the substance of what you said, I am comfortable with everything you said, even though the word usage may be different. It's, in my view, which is not based on being enlightened, because I'm not, but based on, reason and whatever evidence is available to us. I think the mind of nature out there, mind at large, is almost certainly not metacognitive. In other words, it's not doing what it's doing because it deliberated and drew a plan. It's doing what it's doing because it is what it is. And it has a property or properties of impetus. In other words, a will, a natural, spontaneous will. And that's why it behaves the way it does. So that lines up. I am completely with you as well, that the world we think we perceive is not raw perception. It is constituted by layers and layers of interpretation that we map onto the raw pixels of the screen of perception. We never see the raw pixels, we see things, but things are conceptual constructs. Out there is only a sea of pixels. We arbitrarily draw boundaries between groups or sets of pixels and assign names to them, carving out objects in a world that essentially has no objects. The world is simply what it is. It's one whole within a differentiation. Objects are merely nominal. We impose those boundaries onto the world for convenience. So we can tell the secondhand car salesman that we want a car. So he knows what we want, but there is no car. There is just the world. So I'm with you there as well. Now the question is, cognitively, given how human beings are put together, the mental configuration that we are, is it possible to access the raw pixels? And when I say pixels, I don't mean only vision, I mean all modalities of perception, but I'll stick to the metaphor of pixels. Is it possible to see the raw pixels without interpretation, without projection? It's certainly very difficult. I have not been able to do that. But then again, I have a pretty hard head, so nobody should take my boundaries for their own, because probably your boundaries are further away than mine. But I think in principle, it stands to reason that, given the amount of neuroplasticity that we have, according to science, in principle, it stands to reason that it should be potentially possible for a human being that has engaged in the right kind of introspective activity and training to register the raw pixels of perception without layers of interpretation, in which case objects would vanish. Individual events would vanish. There would be just the dynamics of pixel, the tapestry of reality. In Schopenhauer's terminology, our interpretation of the pixels is an abstract representation. It entails metacognitive functions. But the pixels themselves under analytic idealism are still a representation of some form. They are still not reality as it is in itself out there. The pixels of the screen of perception are like dials on the dashboard. They are not the thing that is measured outside the airplane. They are the way the measurement results are presented to the pilot. And then abstract representations are the pilot's interpretation of the dials. So the pilot doesn't even see the raw dials. The pilot only sees the interpretations and the meta-interpretations of the dials. I think the pilot can, in principle, could perceive the dials directly, but even then, the dials are themselves a representation, not the thing represented. And then the question is, can we human beings access the thing in itself without the intermediation of the dashboard and the dials? according to Schopenhauer, we can, because the will that is out there, whose dynamics we measure and then represent in the form of dials, and then interpret in the form of abstract representations, that will out there is the same as the will in here. So in principle, through introspection and descending even below the level of raw perception, but going under perception, going into the more primordial, more fundamental activity of mind in us, what we should then at some point experience is the raw will, which is the same thing that is out there, even though it's manifesting itself out there in a different way than it's manifesting itself in here. So two different manifestations, but the same thing manifesting. So perceiving or registering, cognizing the raw will in us, maybe the word cognition is not correct here, but relating or becoming directly acquainted with the thing in itself in us allows us to experience something of the same kind as what is going on in the world out there as it is in itself. Even though the activity of the world out there as it is in itself is a different manifestation of that thing than the manifestation that we can introspect into in ourselves. The final question is, can we perceive the activity of the thing in itself out there as opposed to the activity of the thing in itself in here? For that, the dissociation would have to at least be reduced. The dissociative boundary would have to become more porous, more permeable, at least in a temporary transition, a period of time, a limited period of time in which the dissociation goes down. It is in principle conceivable that a human being could access the very external manifestation of the thing in itself. But of course, if a human being succeeded in doing that, they would come back and not be able to utter a single word about it, because that's not what language evolved to capture. So yeah, that was my commentary.
Beautiful. Yes to everything you said, even some surprising correspondences to me. For example, this use of the word representation, because in this tradition of Tantric Shaivism, they say all phenomena that appear within consciousness are representations, in the sense that it is the one or the universal being representing itself to itself in that way. So even whatever, a wall, that is the one representing itself to itself in that way. And so the term vimarsha, which can be translated representation, is used in terms of all perceived phenomena, whether they are then further interpreted by the mind or not, which is that's another layer of representation, a mental representation. But even in raw experience, that's still consciousness representing it to itself in that form. And also the tradition says that metacognition can only happen in embodied beings. So the one consciousness, in fact, embodies itself as us and whatever other sentient beings are out there, in order to have the experience of metacognition that it can't have on this massive scale or disembodied scale. So that's lots of fascinating correspondences. The only thing I want to get drill down on here is this metaphor of the dashboard of dials, because, well, two things about it. One is that in the direct experience of this paradigm I'm talking about, where subject-object distinction falls away, all conceptuality falls away, and there's just raw experience. In that state, there's also no external, internal. There's no division, and maybe, yeah, you could talk about it as the dissociative boundary becoming incredibly porous, or even temporarily non-existent, because there's no sense of internal versus external anymore whatsoever. And there's not even a sense of distance. For example, we think the perception of distance or depth is probably in first order reality, but it turns out to be more in second order reality, meaning to say, in this mode that's free of conceptual superimposition, there isn't even distance. The visual field is the visual field, and it's right here. It's immediate. It's zero distance, because distance is something the mind is creating in experience, you know. But so with no internal external, then it becomes interesting to talk about what is really out there. But one thing I'll say is that the dashboard of dials metaphor could make someone think, and I don't even know if this is your intention. That's why I want to get clear on it. But it could make someone think that there's a world behind this world, that there's an intermediate stage between absolutely formless awareness or formless absolute or formless being and what appears as the qualia or the pixels, you know. And we say in this tradition, no, there's no intermediate stage. There's no world behind this world. Meaning, to put a bit better example, like the Tantric Shaiva master Abhinavagupta says, all phenomena are like appearances in a mirror held within the one consciousness. They're like, there's this mirror-like quality to consciousness. But then the objectioner asks, well, what is the original that is being reflected in this mirror of awareness that we call phenomena? And he says there isn't an original. So it's like a mirror with a ton of things appearing in the mirror, but without an original that matches in some way the appearance in the mirror, right? So he's trying to find a way to say, with the words available to him in his era, that there isn't something that is intermediate between absolutely formless being and appearances. There isn't something being reflected. So I don't even know if I can say this precisely enough to try to get at what I'm talking about. But I worry that when you talk about the dashboard of dials, that the person then imagines, just like there's a world outside the airplane, because in the metaphor, the window is blackened, right? It's just the dashboard of dials. And do we want, is it your understanding that there is a world outside the airplane? Or not? And if so, like, what would it even mean to talk about a world that is in no way ever perceptible? Like, how is that even a world?
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm trying to get at?
Yeah. I will elaborate on how I see things, and so we can figure out if we're actually talking about the same thing, but getting caught in language, which I suspect is what's happening. Metaphors are linguistic artifact as well, and you can usefully, they are useful up to a certain point, and then they become confusing if you try to stretch them beyond. The airplane with the dashboard and the sky outside the airplane are both the same world. They are not two worlds. The airplane is a configuration of that single world. And in the metaphor, we are not only the pilot or the little ego in the airplane, we are the entire airplane. So the dashboard is us too. So the representations that arise in the dashboard, they are us. They are expressions of our own mind, excitations of our own mind. So there is a very direct sense in which you could say, under the premises of analytic idealism, that the subject-object distinction disappears in certain states of consciousness insofar as one realizes by direct acquaintance that the very experiential qualities of perception are excitations of the perceiving subject. It is the perceiving subject allowing itself to be modulated that gives rise to the qualities of perception, the redness of an apple, the bitterness of a lemon. These things are not distinct from the subject that perceives the apple, that perceives the lemon. These things are excitations of the subject. So the seeming objects on the screen of perception are excitations of the subject in exactly the same way that the thoughts of the subject are not separate from the subject. In the same way that the emotions of a subject are not separate from the subject. So in the same way that you can go down an avenue of thoughts and emotions in your mind, and you would never say your thoughts and emotions are something other than your own subjectivity. They arise as excitations of your subjectivity. You don't confuse your thoughts and emotions with objects that are out there. You know that they are your own. The claim is that there is a state of consciousness that reflects a deeper level, a more true level of reality, in which when you walk down an avenue and you perceive the trees and the houses and the cars around you, it is the same thing going on than when you go down an avenue of your own thoughts. In other words, the trees, the cars, everything, all of those qualities of perceptions, just like your thoughts and emotions, are excitations of your subjectivity. So there is no true distinction between subject and object. It's a linguistic artifact that has had some practical uses over history, some practical usefulness even. So in that sense, I would agree immediately that even when it comes to the perceptual world, the world of representations in Schopenhauer's language, there is no real distinction between subject and object. Now, a deeper level would be, but what about the external world as it is in itself, other than how we represent it? Because the qualities of the representation, the qualities of perception, okay, they are our own. It's our mind making it up, exciting itself, so to represent external states of the world. But what about the external states of the world prior to our representing it? Are they subjects from our perspective? Well, also not, because if what we are as seeming individuals is a dissociative process in the mind of nature, then the activity of the mind of nature beyond that dissociative boundary that characterizes us, those are still mental processes in the same mind, because dissociation is merely an illusion. That's why the patients with dissociative identity disorder can be cured. They can reintegrate all their alters and remember the memories of each alter as their own memories. So that shows that this dissociation is a kind of illusion. It's something that makes it feel as though we were separate from the rest, but that's just an illusion. We are not really separated. So you could say that even when it comes to the world that is represented, as opposed to its representations, which arise in our own dissociated outer, even in that case, there is no real distinction. It's the same subject being excited. Now, how does that so-called external world then exist? In what way can a thing exist beyond its perception, beyond the perception of it, which is the question you argued? And I wanted to make two quick points on this. One is space and time are themselves the parameters of the dashboard, the parameters of the representation. So when we use the metaphor of the dashboard to say that there is a world outside or behind the dashboard, that's already not really accurate, because now we are trying to use the concept of space independently of the dashboard, which is impossible. So what we mean really by that, or at least what I mean when I say there is a world behind the dashboard, what I mean is there is mental activity that is cognitively inaccessible to a particular dissociated alter. So you can think of it as something analogous to what happens when you don't remember something you know. When you don't remember something you know, and that you then later can recall, that thing you can't remember is a content of your own mind that you can't access cognitively. It's not behind or outside your mind. It's not separated from you in space. It's a matter of database access that we are talking about, not a spatial thing. So when we say there is something behind the dashboard, that's what we actually mean. And we are using the concept of space here merely metaphorically. What we actually mean is something of the kind that happens when you don't remember something that you know. The other comment, and this is my final comment, even activity in mind at large, states of the sky outside the airplane, that aren't measured and aren't represented on the dashboard. In other words, activity in the mind of nature that no living being is perceiving exists insofar as it is experienced from a first-person perspective. So let me map this one level lower in the hierarchy of being metaphorically to try to get across what I mean. Suppose you're having a thought. A neuroscientist can perceive your thought by doing some neuroimaging, doing some brain imaging of the patterns of your brain activity. So when you are having a thought, that thought can be perceived by somebody other than you as an image on a brain scanner. But if that thought you had wasn't perceived because nobody put you in a brain scanner, in what sense does it still exist? Well, it still exists because it was experienced directly by you. It was experienced by direct acquaintance, not through the intermediation of a scanner or a screen of perception of a dashboard full of dials. It wasn't represented externally, but it still exists internally from a first-person perspective. So the claim is that even the mental states of nature that nobody is perceiving, they still exist because they are experienced from a first-person perspective by mind at large. That would be the claim. And then you might ask, well, but what is the difference between the subject in mind at large and the subject in here? And the answer is none, because the separation is an illusion. But conceptually, it's still useful to talk of the real states of the world out there independently of perception. Because if we don't do that, the problem we run into is the problem Barclay ran into when he said to be is to be perceived. So if nobody is perceiving the tree that falls in the forest, then the tree didn't fall in the forest, which is counterintuitive at least, because we all describe the same world. You know, you park your car in your garage at night when you come back from work, and then presumably nobody's perceiving it throughout the night. Next morning you go down, there's the car exactly where you left it. So something has held the states of the world when nobody was perceiving it. What is that something? Under analytic idealism, it would be just mind at large. And we wouldn't run into Barclay's difficulty of having to postulate that God himself perceives what no living creature perceives, which is artificial and forced. But he's still conceiving of God as a sort of a super individual, which your own tradition denies. There is no such super individual that himself has a super dashboard and is perceiving everything that exists. And by means of that super perception, things exist. No, you don't need that under analytic idealism, because God doesn't need to perceive. God can think, God can feel. And it's thoughts and emotions, between quotes, because God is not human, so it's not the same kind of mental activity that we have, but it's the closest thing we can use as an analogy. The thoughts of God, the emotions of God that aren't perceived because they aren't represented in any dashboard, in any screen of perception, they still exist because God thinks them, because God feels them. They still exist from a first-person perspective. And without the dissociative boundary, we would be the God that feels and perceives that. But then there would be no metacognition, which is, again, something you elaborated upon. So I don't know whether this helps, but that's my best attempt at translating what we are talking about.
Yeah, that's super helpful. So far, I'm not entirely convinced that there's necessarily a difference between your view and Barclay's view, because given the language he had to work with at the time, well, I haven't read enough Barclay actually, to be sure, but you know, you seem to be saying that there is something that it's like to be God. which would be incomprehensible from the time space perspective of this limited subjectivity or within a dissociative boundary. Is that right?
That's right.
We're not saying, and maybe even Barclay wasn't saying, that God is a superhuman person who's watching your car for you to make sure it doesn't disappear when nobody's perceiving it, but rather that all these forms that appear within our dashboard, in a sense, have their correspondences as potentialities within mind at large. It's almost makes you want to invoke, the Platonic ideas, like the potentiality for consciousness to appear as car is there, and all possible forms exist as pure potentialities, even though they're not really forms, because it's much, much deeper and more subtle than that. And that is what provides the basis for the manifestation of the form that appears on the dashboard. Is that sort of on the right track?
Yeah, completely on the right track. You touched on an important point. What did Barclay actually mean, and how would he have expressed that in the language of his time? I think a lot of philosophers are misinterpreted today. Sometimes the misinterpretation is obvious because the philosopher wrote the right words. Like Schopenhauer, he wrote the right words and he's still misinterpreted. In other cases, however, such as Barclay and Spinoza, to mention two examples that are close to me, they wrote the words of their time. So if I were to come in now and say, what Spinoza actually meant is this and that, I would be killed in scholarship, because they would ask me, on the basis of what are you saying this? Because look at what the guy wrote, look at his words. And what we will fail to see is that those words had a different meaning a few hundred years ago. So to give you a precise example, the one we are discussing now, Barclay and his tenet that to be is to be perceived. Today, we use the word perception as experiences that are mediated by the 5 sensory modalities, stuff we see, hear, taste, smell, and touch. But in olden times, perception was synonymous with experience. I perceive my emotions. I perceive my thoughts. So people use the word to perceive in the sense of to experience. And then to be is to be experienced is correct. But I can't go in now and say, well, Barclay just wrote the wrong words. What he actually meant in the language of today is this and that. I can't win that in scholarship, because I would have to claim that I traveled in time and I talked to Bishop Barclay and he clarified to me what he meant. I can't do that. Another example, Spinoza is seen today as a dual aspect monism, or even a multi-aspect monist. He's perceived as someone who says there is God as a substance, not as an entity, but a substance, a type of existence. So, and then mind and matter are aspects or forms of manifestation of this divine substance, which is itself distinct from mind and matter. So neither mind or matter are absolute, only divine essence is absolute, and mind and matter are just facets or forms of expression, modalities, modes of that divinity. But if you look at words, the Greek word for mind is psyche. And in the time of Spinoza, psyche meant the human psyche, not psyche as an ontological category. That's not how people used the word. Psyche was always an individuated psyche. So when Spinoza says psyche and matter are modes or aspects of the divine substance, he's still leaving open the possibility that the divine substance is mental. And it is individuated mentation, dissociated mentation, that is a particular form of expression of that substance. I bet with you, if I could go back in time to the 17th century and go with Spinoza along the canals of Amsterdam and sit somewhere and have ale with him for an afternoon, and we could hash it out in Dutch, although he used some old Dutch that is difficult, but it would still be possible. I think I would be able to come back and tell you this is what he meant. He didn't mean that mind as an ontological category was reducible. What he meant was that individual minds were reducible. But I can't make a strong argument for that based on the words he wrote. That's the difficulty.
Yeah. In other words, for him, mind and matter meant subject and object.
Yeah, both
in a
as
way.
expressions of a mental substance.
The view that you present under the name Analytic Idealism, it matches this Indian tradition that I study, but it matches no other Indian tradition or Eastern philosophy that I'm aware of, which might not be obvious to people. And I just want to take this example of excitation. This was brilliant what you said about the experience, you know, the perception, the qualia, the phenomena. It is an excitation of the subject, not. This is different from how Vedanta and other philosophies view the subject as being a pure witness, right? There's a witness consciousness, and they absolutely deny that the experience is an excitation of the subject, whereas Tantric Shaivism says that's exactly what it is. In fact, every experience is an excitation of the subject, and even like not just thoughts and feelings, but you know, if you're these so-called physical objects appearing in the perceptual field are also excitations of the subject, as you said. And that's what you have in the non-dual mode of experience. If you're holding a lemon in your hand, it is just as much what you are as your own thoughts and feelings in that non-dual mode. But it's so different from the thought-based experience that you can have on psychedelics or whatever. It's like, whoa, this lemon is really me. You know, it's prior to any thought. The whatever you're touching is obviously what you are appearing as that, you know. And so total correspondence there. And this is part of what makes the internal external dichotomy disappear, not just the subject object dichotomy, and or maybe it's really the same thing, but the internal external dichotomy disappears because there is no external. There is just what I am appearing in all these ways that I don't have words for unless I bring the mind in. So I totally am so happy to hear that you're not positing there are two worlds, the world of the dashboard and the world outside, but there's only material or phenomena, whatever we want to call it, that are inaccessible to the database of this subjective point of view.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
total, yeah.
I think any philosophy of non-duality cannot be sustained by if one postulates a fundamental distinction between experience and the subject of experience, because then it's not non-dual. So that's a bullet I think everybody will ultimately have to bite. But you know, all this wisdom, I'm not a scholar in this subject, so you correct me please, whatever I will say wrongly. But my superficial understanding is that the wisdom comes from the Vedas. So that's 3,500 years ago in this valley. And there have been different interpretations. And for instance, the Upanishads are an interpretation of the Vedas. And I don't think the differences between the interpretations are malicious or reflect a lack of understanding. I suspect that they reflect different levels of concession to vulgar intuition and language. Because if you make no concession to vulgar intuitions and language. And when I say vulgar, I don't mean it in a bad way. I mean ordinary intuitions and language. If you make no concessions to it, such that every word you utter is consistent with the message you're trying to get across without any semblance of contradiction, you're not going to reach many people, because there will be a too large chasm between where they are and where you're trying to bring them. There would be no common language. So people make concessions. I make concessions. I concede space and time because it's built into language. I make concessions all over the place. And I was having a discussion a few months ago with Swami Sarvapriyananda. I think it's online. It was recorded at least. And we were talking about this, the levels of concession. Mahayana Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism in particular, makes a concession to the individual self. And I was also having a discussion with a Rinpoche, I forgot his name, the other day, in which at the end we sort of didn't agree on this, because to me that's a concession that is unnecessary to make. We don't need to make a concession to the fundamental existence of an individual self. I think we evolved enough, even in the West as cultures, that we can bite the bullet that the individual self is just a narrative. It's never been there. It's not real. It's just a story we tell ourselves. But Tibetan Mahayana Buddhism still holds on to that concession because it has historically been helpful. So yeah, perhaps if we could, become each one of these sages, each one of these teachers, and experience from their own first-person perspective what they mean, we would realize that there is more in common across these different sages than we think. It's just that they're making different concessions to try to reach people. I suspect that. I don't know for a fact.
Part of the argument in Shaivism is that some of those other sages didn't go far enough in their introspection, that they were right as far as they went, and we can see the concessions they're making to ordinary understanding to try to make it comprehensible, but still they didn't go far enough in the process to have this a more all-encompassing view. And that argument seems to be borne out by the fact that it's these sages who lived 1,000 years ago that are able to articulate a very detailed philosophy, as you're doing, lots of books saying here's how we can understand this from all these different points of view. Just one more thing before we go to questions. I just wanted to say something about time, because you can reach a point in this process of whatever we call it, spiritual awakening, where you can enter into non-dual mode almost at will, not through the desire of the mind, a limited desire, but a movement. It's hard to describe, but a movement like a wave that you follow into a non-dual mode, and you can return to the normal subject-object mode as well. But in the radically non-dual mode, time itself appears very differently. For example, you see that cause and effect are a mental construct that makes sense, that it's the best mental construct to have in the context of linear time, where one moment succeeds another. And what's happening in this moment is explicable in terms of what happened in the previous moments, that is a totally legitimate story to tell when you're perceiving in terms of linear time, but it's still just a mental construct, just the most useful mental construct. And then in this radically non-dual mode, I try to describe it, as instead of linear time going along like that, it's all the phenomena or qualia of experience are arising directly as a direct expression of the absolute with spontaneous immediacy. In other words, in this non-dual mode, you do not perceive that phenomena are caused by other phenomena from another moment previous, but rather that all phenomena are arising as a direct expression of the absolute with this spontaneous immediacy, uncaused. Now, when I describe it in words, it sounds like a belief someone could hold, but it's nothing like a belief. It's a very, very immediate, direct experience of the uncaused nature of everything when you're perceiving in this mode in which there's no linear time at all. So, this is also part of my kind of trying to get at that when there's truly no mental filter or imposition, even time itself ceases to have meaning, and distance as well. So just like you said, Bernardo, that the time and space are features of the dashboard. They're like the most fundamental features of the dashboard.
Yeah, causation has no no future. Even in modern scholarship, in modern analytic philosophy, the problem of causation is a very difficult one. It's an unsolved one. Because when we say, well, one thing causes another, we sort of intuitively understand that, but that intuition hides the fact that there is no substance to the concept of causality. Nobody has ever been able to pin down and say what it is. It's just an empirical fact that certain events follow from other events in time under certain circumstances. But what is the essence of causation? We don't know that. And the reason we don't know that is that it's not there. There is no causation. There is only a universal pattern. And what passes for causation is an artifact of our cognitive system's limitation, which was put together by evolution to avoid cognitive overload. There is this wonderful metaphor by Alan Watts, you probably know, like a meditator sitting in front of a wooden fence, and there is a tiny slit across the planks of the wooden fence. So through that slit, the meditator can see something about the other side. And then a cat goes along the fence on the other side, and then the meditator sees a cat's head, and then a moment later, a cat's tail. And then the cat turns around, comes again, and then the meditator sees a cat's head, and then a cat's tail. And every time the cat walks along, it's the cat head followed by the cat's tail. And the meditator says, the head causes the tail. That's what causality is. It's an artifact of our inability to see the whole cat. Because if we saw the whole cat, there is no causality. There is just the cat. But because we can't see the whole cat, we are too puny dissociative processes that would cognitively overload. If we saw the whole cat, we see the tail following the head every single time. And then this conceptual construct called causality, which has no substance, has no essence, but it's operationally useful. It serves a lot of purposes and therefore should be used as if it were true. But one should not, for a moment, I think, entertain the notion that it's actually true, that there is such a thing as causality out there that isn't merely a human cognitive construction.
Yeah, in fact, in my tradition, it's said, if you were to try to map causality, you would have to map every event in space-time to every other event in space-time. Which
Big Bang Theory tells you that. Quantum entanglement and Big Bang Theory tell you that if you are to have full knowledge of the causal chain of the universe, then the result of that is the universe.
Exactly.
There is no distinction between causation and that which causes, or the whole pattern, the whole universe. And time, again, is just a dimension like space. So the whole pattern of the universe stretches across all the dimensions of space and that of time as well. And that thought alone shows you there is no such a thing as causality. Causality is an artifact of our slit-like cognition that scans the world like this. And then we see the cat's head followed by the cat's tail, and the head causes the tail. Okay, and get Nobel Prizes by saying that.
And that's all true. And just to mention, because I hope that you and everyone experience it at some point, if you haven't already, that even knowing all that, there's still this absolute astonishment at this radically non-dual experience of phenomena arising uncaused as the direct expression of pure being itself, with spontaneous immediacy. I love that phrase because it almost captures, but it still doesn't. And before we move on to questions, just the last thing, I want to quote Abhinavagupta accurately because I paraphrased him before. So, writing 1,000 years ago in Kashmir, he said, "This entire conditioned reality," where conditioned means appearing in terms of space, time, cause, and so on. "This entire conditioned reality is simply a reflection in the space of awareness, capital A awareness, the awareness of mind at large." And then the objectioner says, well, what would be the original that is being reflected here? And he says, there's no such thing whatsoever. And the objectioner says, what, you mean the reflection has no cause? And Abhinavagupta says, oh, then your question concerns a cause. So what's the point of using the word original? The cause is simply the will of the one divine consciousness, which is synonymous with its total autonomy.
At the end of the day, some concessions are necessary, because if we really go all the way, we're just not, it's not that we are better or ahead, it's just that different people have turned over different rocks. And what you see under the rocks you've turned over and others haven't, is not communicatable sometimes. So do you think that we can get away with no concession? Because to make no concession,
no.
we would have to say nothing ever happens, everything just is, and what is identical to what is not. And people just throw their arms up and, and see what I mean?
It's a matter of how, it's a matter of the progression of the introspector or the meditator. But I think we have to be careful what concessions we make, because when we make concessions, it becomes all too easy for the mind to grab onto those things and say, aha, my beliefs are right, real and right after all. And, you know, we're trying to point to something deeper. So the nature of the concessions and which concessions are made is a very delicate matter that we have to be skillful about if we don't want to give people somewhere to, you know, hang their particular attachments and ego concepts and so on.
I see what
you know. Just like with most Hindu philosophy, they use the word self, and it gives people a pretext for hanging on to the subtlest version of their own ego and calling that self, when that's not, in fact, what's meant at all. You know, should we take some questions before we're out of time?
Yeah, that'd be great. Great dialogue. Thank you so much.
As far as I understood it, the will is a property of that consciousness, and it's what creates basically what we perceive as something, like reality, whether it's in its pure form or what we see as disassociations. But is the absolute formless consciousness like nothing, or the will something, or can they does the absolute formless consciousness exist without the will? Is it just a byproduct? Like, what's the correlation there?
The absolute formless consciousness is nothing filled with absolute potential, we could say, simultaneously. So the mind has a hard time comprehending that. And will is inherent within it, whether that will is flowing or activated or exercised or not. That's another question. But will is inherent within it. From the point of view of my tradition, we say, as opposed to Vedanta and some others, that will is an intrinsic property, or not even property. It's not a property. It's a capacity. It's an intrinsic capacity or potency of consciousness. And when that potency is exercised, there appears to be a world. And like I said, even the appearance of something like a wall is will. It's will right there. It's not there's will and then wall. It's the wall is the will of the absolute to appear in that way. Okay, so it's never without the will, but the will might not be exercised in a particular moment, as when in deep meditation you plunge into a void completely bereft of sense experience whatsoever, completely bereft of qualia. Then awareness rests within itself, not exercising its will to perceive in any particular modality. So, and then there are other shaktis, other potencies intrinsic to consciousness, such as the potential to have cognition, and the potential to move, to be active, to that movement is intrinsic. Dynamism, to put it more accurate, dynamism is intrinsic to consciousness, whether or not it's exercised. And this is all as opposed to other Indian philosophies that say consciousness is supremely static. It doesn't ever move. And we say, no, it does. And that's why we don't have to deny the world. We don't have to say it's unreal.
If I can maybe add something, it's just a metaphor, because I know how difficult it was for me to grasp this. So a metaphor that may be helpful is the following. Imagine a guitar string. The guitar string is not a musical note. It's not any note, right? It's just a guitar string. But if you pluck it and you cause it to excite itself, it produces a musical note, and it can produce a whole number of musical notes depending on how you pluck it, and depending on how you excite it, or depending on the particular pattern of excitation it takes. Now imagine that all things are musical notes. The guitar string is then no thing. It's just the potential for the appearance of a musical note, but it is no thing. Yet it's not nothing, because there is a potential. It's not complete devoid of all possible capacities. It is the potential for all musical notes. But only musical notes are things in the way you and I talk about it. So the guitar string in itself is nothingness or no thingness being excited. When no thingness is not excited, it's no thing. But it's not nothing.
During this course, we've been talking a lot about this underlying mathematical archetypes. First was Michael Levin talking about it, and last time we were going to IIT a little bit. It has been truly interesting, and I know that the Kashmir Shaivism has a really, really vast mythological heritage, which in these mythological ways describes these mathematical archetypes that we've been talking about. So yeah, I wanted to hear you guys talk a little bit more on this matter and comment on this subject.
The philosophers of Shaivism, they actually discount most of the mythological material which is found in the Puranas, not in the Tantras per se. And they describe the mythological version of the religion as being for people who have merely a casual interest in the tradition. And so they don't try to unpack deep meaning from mythological stories. In general, they don't. And rather, they take a different approach. Again, speaking of the philosophers of the tradition, which is sort of esoteric vis-a-vis the mainstream. But just to say about this idea of underlying mathematical structures, they had this idea, but not in terms of math, but they spoke of it with the metaphor of language. Well, it's kind of more than a metaphor. And so they said there's these 4 levels of speech that I already alluded to earlier. And the deepest level of speech is not even rightly called speech. It's very similar to the usage of the word logos in Gnostic Christianity, from which you get the opening of the Gospel of John, which is influenced by Gnostic Christianity. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, the term being translated as word in the English version of the Bible is logos in the original Greek, logos. And there's this corresponding concept in Shaivism, which is vak, which also can be translated the word. And the deepest level of the word is the structure that makes language possible, meaning to say the structure within consciousness. It's not even right to call it a structure. The potentiality for structure inherent within consciousness, at least embodied consciousness, that makes language possible, also structures the world of phenomena. That there's a deep, it's almost like in fact, they do say the term matrix, so that like almost like the code of the Matrix in the famous movie, they say matrika. Matrika means matrix. It means a pattern or structure that gives rise to more complex patterns. So a fundamental pattern that makes other patterns possible. That's matrika in Sanskrit. So they're saying that there's this deep matrika, there's this deep, very subtle structure within consciousness that makes both language and the appearance of discrete phenomena in a patterned way possible. And so it's not mathematical per se, right? You could attempt to represent it mathematically, but it's more like that which makes mathematics possible and that which provides the regularity to the phenomena that mathematics are mapping. So I don't know how this corresponds to analytic idealism. Maybe Bernardo can come in.
Or IIT. IIT is an attempt to model experience as it is informed by what IIT calls a substrate, which in the context of the philosophy we are discussing here, a substrate is a representation. So IIT is an attempt to model experience as it feels like from a first-person perspective, based on its representation from a third-person perspective. It's an attempt to link these two domains, first and third person, through a kind of transfer function. And that has many very useful, very important practical applications, such as figuring out whether somebody is truly unconscious or just having locked-in syndrome. There will be a workshop on this, by the way, this summer in Switzerland. And other practical applications in medicine, in neuroscience, in neurology. But because it's an attempt to model the dynamics of experience based on whatever is measurable about it, it doesn't attempt to go deeper into the very nature of all things. So, and I don't say this in a sense of trying to put down IIT, because any scientific theory is an attempt to model behavior, and therefore intrinsically, because of its very strengths as a method, the scientific method does not tackle the ultimate beingness of things, which is an issue of metaphysics. So IIT lines up with everything we were discussing, but it doesn't replace it. It's not an alternative formulation. And yet, what we are discussing here also doesn't replace what IIT can do. Analytic idealism cannot tell you in an ICU whether your non-responsive patient is suffering from locked-in syndrome or is really vegetative and unconscious. You see, these are two epistemic approaches that have their strengths in non-overlapping domains, even though they are consistent with one another.
Sometimes I wonder what I'm doing in this world gone mad. People's irresistible attraction to overtoxicity, obnoxiousness, and downright stupidity is some kind of mass psychosis that will end our civilization. Why I am ever here? What's the point of talking reason? It's futile. So this quote appeared in the middle of the night on 25th of February as a Bernardo Facebook post. So it would be nice that Bernardo and Christopher could tackle that question in a dialogue.
Bernardo, is this something you said?
Yes.
Or this is you? Okay.
I said that, yes. And I own it. I will own it right now. I said that. There is a room in the palace of my mind where I entered, and that was my experience. Yes.
When we say the world, we mean human culture and politics. It is almost devoid of sanity of any recognizable kind. the thing is, from my point of view, it doesn't need to be it doesn't need to be a reason for despair, because there's a bigger picture going on. There's a bigger pattern, right? And like, if this civilization needs to crash and burn in order for humans, whatever humans are left, to birth something much more aligned with the nature of reality, instead of with the foibles of their own mind and their own unrestrained whimsical impulses and so on, then that's what needs to happen. It's like in the Tantric tradition, we have goddess Kali, as she is that which devours all things. So she's not horrible, she's wonderful, she's a goddess. Okay, she's not a demon. And so we teach in this tradition that the ending, the devouring, the destruction is beautiful, because it makes way for something else. And the more thorough the destruction, the more radical the rebirth can be. So it's not that we wish for more thorough destruction. It's more like we try to cultivate the trust that whatever the pattern is doing, because it is just the pattern, right? Because I know Bernardo knows very well, we humans are not separate from nature. We are nature. Nature made itself into us, as Alan Watts famously said, just as a tree flowers, the earth peoples, at least in this phase, right? If civilization crashes and burns, no doubt people of the future will look back and say, how could they have thought that rampant consumerism was going to work out as a sustainable model? How could they have thought that making more and more and more plastic things endlessly was even, how could they even let that be legal? You know what I mean? They'll have this incomprehension because they'll be in a radically different paradigm, the paradigm that is forced in a way through the whatever level of destruction needs to happen. So it's not a good thing. It's not a thing to say, yay, if because maybe a bunch of people die too if civilization collapses. But do you see what I mean? Like from the point of view of that bigger picture, there has to be the actualization of the destructive potential of an unworkable paradigm for a new paradigm to emerge. And so that's why it's possible to not just become utterly cynical in the face of all this stupidity. If the stupidity is unsustainable as it is, then it won't sustain. That's part of what it means to say it's unsustainable. It can't sustain, So we may or may not get to see the next paradigm that comes around, but there will be one, right? Because here we're amplifying that, like we have a cultural structure and a political structure that amplifies humanity's worst tendencies, and that is utterly unsustainable. And humans, once they accept its unsustainability due to catastrophic collapse if needed, they will form another paradigm. And maybe it'll be informed by some of these discussions, even if we're dead.
I think what Christopher said is correct. He took a step back, he took a step out of the human condition and approached the situation from a broader natural perspective in which humanity has a certain role to play, but it's not the sum total of what's going on. And even within the context of humanity, there may be a new civilization that needs to come up, and for there to be space for that, maybe the old has to be gotten rid of to some extent. So I understand that, and I think it is valid to take that step out of humanity and contemplate the situation from a broader perspective. And I think there is nothing immoral about speaking truth from a broader perspective. So let me emphasize this, and I'm emphasizing this because of what I'm about to say. At the same time, and now I'm talking about me and my limitations as a seeming person, as a seeming individual, there is a big part of me that rages against taking a step out of humanity and relativizing humanity itself. There is something in me that feels that as immoral, even though I know it's not. And it is not immoral. But there is something in me that rebels and rages against it as if it were immoral. And I don't want to disenfranchise that part of me. So I will not delete that tweet. I will just concur with everything Christopher said without deleting it. Because I feel, now even if I say that, it will sound like as if I am suggesting that Christopher doesn't feel the same, which I'm sure he does. It's just that my sense of belonging in humanity, of being part of humanity, makes me feel extremely invested in this civilization where I am right now, in this particular harvest of the fruits of planet Earth that peoples. And therefore, there is something in me that rejects very strongly the idea of taking a step out of it and analyzing it in a more clear-headed, enlightened fashion, even though that is correct and probably what we should all do. But then again, there is that part of me that says, no, 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 don't do that. Don't do that. You are in the game. You have skin in the game. And it's appropriate sometimes to say what I said.
Well, in fact, I want to celebrate that part of you. I call it the heart of compassion. You know, you care, and that caring is beautiful. I absolutely want to celebrate that. And here's the reconciliation of the two perspectives, okay? That when you're having these feelings that you know produce that kind of post, I would suggest that you and anyone having those sorts of feelings could look deeper and find that the actual source of them is love. Like, you care about human beings. You want them to experience a much better way. You want them to be free of this stupidity and toxicity. You want them to value that which is going to cause their own flourishing. What is more frustrating than seeing humans cling to that which does not contribute to their flourishing, which contributes to the opposite, you know? So it's your caring and love, even if you didn't use those words, that is motivating, that is giving rise to these feelings of profound frustration when people cannot even identify what contributes to their own flourishing and what doesn't, you know? And so when you get in touch with that source, you know, the care, the love and compassion, then that can then be reconciled with the sort of logical what bigger view I was talking about, because ultimately we could even say that the flow of the pattern of being is a flow of love, even though it's nothing like what most people mean when they use the word love in a normal everyday human sense, you know, because in my tradition anyway, this will that Schopenhauer talks about is for us indistinguishable from love. And so even though there's not a teleology here, it's not that consciousness is going somewhere specific and we're all going to get to the promised land. No teleology, but still there's a value to embracing the pattern, the pattern of being, the way it flows, because there is a tendency within the pattern to move towards harmony, even if that harmony then gets disrupted again, and then it begins again the process of moving towards harmony. So, you know, that systems don't work if they don't have sufficient harmony. So then they implode and something else comes along, and the pattern keeps pulling almost. It's like a magnetic pull within the unconditional infinite love of being, if I get poetic, which is a real experience you can have. You can actually taste that. It's not a love like subject object, me, you type love, right? but it pulls towards harmony. And so that's why it's like, even if the process that we're talking about is unimaginably long, right? That still systems pull towards harmony until they achieve that harmony. And then eventually, of course, something is going to come in and destabilize them and it starts all over again. But that's what it wants to do. And, who are we to say it shouldn't be doing that play of that dance,
Laura asks, it's a quick question, so maybe I'll just read it. Can you confirm what you mean by harmony?
Well, if we try to talk about it too much, then we just go into a conceptualization, But there's this teaching on harmony also in Taoism that is, I just hesitate to try to give it too many words. We know harmony when we feel it, There's even when, let's take the example of a piece of music that has a dissonant tension for a while. There's this dissonant tension, and then the tension resolves, and we there's this like satisfaction in it that's deeper than if there had never been the dissonant tension in the music at all. And we instinctively know harmony when we hear it, see it, feel it, right? But it does take a little bit of a meta awareness, a wider context, right? For example, you might see a cheetah butchering an antelope or whatever, and go, oh my gosh, that's horrible, But if you actually spent enough time in that ecosystem, right, then you would see, oh, the cheetah's not fast enough to catch or not, it can't run long enough. It's very fast, but it can't run long enough to catch the healthiest members of the herd, which is true. It can only catch the weaker members or the older members of the herd. So it actually strengthens the genetic pool of the herd by taking out the weaker ones. And there's this harmony in that, even though there's violence. It's like the violence is situated within a bigger harmony. But the conceptual representation of that harmony is inadequate. We need to feel it. And then when we feel it in our bodies, the natural harmony of a balanced ecosystem, for example, we know that this is how being or consciousness wants to go, even though it doesn't object to disharmony either. It's a mystery. There can be this tipping point in one's spiritual life where you just are so done with resisting reality. You're just so tired of it, and you just let yourself love the pattern as it is. Just love the pattern as it is. Destruction, rebirth, recreation, then more destruction, but that there's a rhythm to it, and it's seeking a harmony in bigger and bigger contexts. Even if it never achieves it, that's not wrong. That's just what it likes to do. And letting yourself just love that is a beautiful thing. Why be in argument with reality? You can grieve, but it doesn't mean that I think there's anything fundamentally wrong with reality. I can't be in resistance to reality as it is, even though parts, there are moments of grief.
Hello. Yeah, maybe my question would be regarding that antelope analogy, where suffering is involved, but ultimately, if you don't have individuals, which you don't have at the ultimate level, and can you have suffering without that?
Depends what you mean by suffering, because when selfhood dissolves, it takes the vast majority of psychological suffering with it. If you do not experience yourself to be a self in the psychological sense, then you can't really have psychological suffering. And then all you have to deal with are the remnants of what we call unresolved past experiences. Samskaras in Sanskrit mean impressions, We don't actually have to reify the notion that they come from the past, but they seem to be that way, where we have these impressions in our body and in our psyche, which are, by the way, all one thing. Psyche is part of body, body is part of psyche. And we have these impressions of unresolved past experiences that sometimes call out for resolution once we're free of the psychological suffering that we experience through believing our own thoughts, believing our own projections, believing I'm a self, you know. You see, when you believe you're a self, you cannot help but self-reference everything that happens. So if somebody says, I don't like you, then you believe I must be unlikable. You know, and so that is the self-referencing gives rise to profound cognitive dissonance, because some people say, I like you, and other people say, I don't like you. So in one moment, you're feeling, the I that I am is likable. In another moment, it's not likable, it's unlikable. And these are incompatible, you know? So, but that cognitive dissonance is itself a kind of signal that the self that you are taking to be real isn't, it's just a mental construct, right? So when you're free of that psychological self, then the mental activity of self-referencing everything that happens ceases, which is astonishing. It's wonderful. I recommend it very highly, right? Because there's no more attributing to an imagined self everything that everybody says or how they behave in your direction, you know? So you're free of these thoughts about, am I likable? Am I not likable? Am I worthy? Am I unworthy? Am I good enough? Am I not good enough? This is all nonsense that evaporates, you know? But when you're free of the psychological self, you can also become much more intimate with the wider reality, and you can feel everything much more acutely, you know? So it depends what you mean by suffering. Like, in a way, this liberation from the falsity of selfhood ends suffering, and it brings you into greater intimacy with pain. But it also brings you into greater intimacy with joy. So things have a way of balancing out. This is kind of the harmony I was talking about too. There's incredible balance. There's exquisite balance in reality when perceived free from the psychological self, you know? So you might think, well, that becoming a lot more intimate with pain doesn't sound good to me, but it's balanced by much greater intimacy with the joy of aliveness, what we could call the joy of aliveness. So it's not a simple question to answer that you ask there.
Yeah, why I'm asking is because below every kind of pain or suffering, there is actually a self. I don't know if, if it's really possible
No,
to...
no, not necessarily. There can be pain with no self.
Mhm.
You know, if someone that you love has just died, and you're there with someone else who loved the person who just died, there's a grief that you can share that is not, it doesn't require a self, you know, or it doesn't matter the exact context, but this grief, it's a way that love manifests. In the absence of the loved one, love manifests as grief temporarily, right? It's just natural. So if you call grief is painful, what most people would consider painful, but it doesn't require any sort of psychological self to arise, you know, or so it's hard to describe until you experience it for yourself. Ironic use of the reflexive pronoun. So there's no suffering, there's no psychological suffering. There's no belief the person should have lived longer. If only they had lived longer. If only I had had another moment with them. That's all nonsense made by the mind. But in absence of that, grief is still natural. It just doesn't get artificially perpetuated by thought. And the grief is seen as part of the beauty of existence. All pain experienced without a psychological self is immediately seen as part of the beauty of existence. And therefore it acquires a different flavor in a way. It's painful, but it's beautiful.
I think he's using the word self in the sense of subject, and without a subject, there can be no suffering. While what you mean by self is the individual self distinct from object and distinct from the world.
This is a good question, and it does allow us to mention that there are these sort of stages of the falling away of self. First, the falling away of psychological self, which is rare enough. It's very rare, actually. But then there can also be the falling away of subject-object distinction.
Exactly.
Which can be a temporary experience that you have before the falling away of psychological self, interestingly. But it never stays. The psychological self has to fall away for the dissolution of subject-object distinction to become your home base, your default state. So in absence of any subject-object distinction, can there be suffering? Yeah, then I would say no. There can't be suffering, and not even pain exactly, because when there's no subject-object distinction, you can't even call an experience painful.
You can separate pain from other. Yeah, you cannot make the distinction from pain from pleasure, as an example in non-duality, in true non-duality. They would be about the same. It would be about the same.
Well, but you can notice intensity. In true non-duality, there can be intensity, but you wouldn't be able to call it pain or something else. Yeah.
Yes, degrees. You can have degrees, but you can't have distinctions.
Yeah, not any meaningful distinctions. Yeah.
Yeah. Makes sense. Thank you very much. Thank you.
But what about the suffering on behalf of others?
When you think you're suffering on behalf of others, you're in a mind thing. There's a mind thing going on, you know. You are imagining what others' suffering is like, and then you're suffering about their suffering. And it's all kind of psychological. You can't know, you know, because my own brother lives on the streets by choice. I've spent time on the streets, and I've discovered, you know, there's the full range of human happiness and the full range of human everything amongst those communities of nomadic or homeless people. And you might see one of these homeless people on the street who really has only a tiny amount of money in their pocket, and they have to refresh it every day somehow. And you might think, yeah, they must be suffering. They must be miserable. And some of them are. But some of them wouldn't trade their way of life for all your so-called comforts. And some of them scoff at you know, the society that we've created in which we can be miserable amidst incredible abundance, you know. So you just don't know what the other person is actually experiencing. And suffering on behalf of others, you know, is sometimes in the spiritual tradition called idiot compassion, whereas true compassion is love. It's love that flows when someone turns towards you and says, I'm struggling. It's not your imagination then. They turn towards you, say, I'm struggling. Could you help me? And your heart opens with care, with love. You know, that's the real thing. And sitting there in your living room or whatever, and thinking about the suffering that must be happening in Afghanistan or wherever else, you know, that's not suffering on behalf of others when you get really upset and depressed over what you imagine is happening there. That's a mind thing, because in reality, the diversity of human experience is extraordinary, even in a war zone. And if you're there on the ground, you know, you're going to see, like, humans, they're experiencing moments of love and compassion and joy amidst the carnage. And some are just having a terrible time, of course. So I just want to make sure that there's clarity on that, because compassion is a beautiful thing, but it's often that this thing the mind wants to do of just wallow in the suffering I have when I imagine other people's suffering is not compassion. And it doesn't benefit anyone really, because you get depressed, Laura said in the chat window about suffering and pain from the point of view of the absolute or mind at large, and what is its meaning in the context of the whole. But I think Bernardo will agree that you can't say that something has meaning in the context of the whole, because that would just be a mental construct. But you can say that it has a place in the context of the whole, and what that place is has to be discovered, as it were, by each person. But there are these forms of suffering, I call them existential suffering or existential angst, that is specifically there to alert you to the fact that you are not in touch with reality. The existential suffering is built into the human system when we are alienated from the truth to one degree or another. So that's an example of suffering that's a signaling mechanism that's has a useful function, which is not to say that all pain has a message to communicate, but a lot of times it does. Amir, let's keep trying this until we can have a conversation where I don't have to leave.
But yeah, so great to have you. Thanks so much for Bernardo, do you want to say any last just before, yeah.
Very thankful to you, Christopher. A lot of what you said, it's like it was made to order for me. So to me, this is one of the best days of the entire event, because I get to benefit a bit more. I mean, I benefit from every day, but today I benefited a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you. And I am so grateful for your work and your brilliance. And, even though people might think your work is so intellectual, I do feel that love and care that's motivating it, that motivates you to keep speaking with people almost every day. And so that's beautiful. Without that, I might not have felt the resonance with your work. It's brilliantly articulated, thought through, but there's this unexpressed foundation of love and care. And so
thank you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay,
fun.
enjoy the rest of your conversation, y'all.
Thanks.
Thank you, Christopher. Take care. Have a good flight.
Thank you.
We will stay on a bit. Just some of it sounds like we're ending the call, assuming, but Bernardo, you're happy to go through to the
sure.
half hour, the regular. Yeah. I just wanted to give you space, as always, to share any reflections.
His last answer is still in my mind. Of course, there's a lot of truth to that. Some of the things we call empathy is just our imagined suffering of others. But I wonder if sometimes we don't really latch into some underlying collective current in the mind of nature that may feel overwhelming occasionally. I think there is some space for that too. I think sometimes the suffering that comes from empathy is not mediated by some imagining. It's like latching onto a duct somewhere in the collective psyche, and it can suck you in big time, even if you can't tell yourself why is it that you're feeling the way you're feeling. I think sometimes that happens as well. I'm not sure, but I think it does.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amir. It's a very quick question to Bernardo. And in a way, Christopher answered it, but I just want to see from your point of view of idealism, do you agree that there's no such thing as determinism or form, in the will of mind at large?
I think the distinction that we make between free will and determinism is based on an assumption that doesn't hold at the level of mind at large. Namely this, when we say, I made a choice because that choice was forced upon me. What we mean is that there is some external force that we don't identify with, and which determined the choice we made. For instance, when you go to work in the morning, you may say, well, that's not my free will choice, because if I don't go to work, I don't get paid. That these are the rules of society, and therefore I don't have a choice. I have to go to work. And this is analogous even to the discussion free will indeterminism when it comes to brain function. If we don't identify with our own brain function, and somebody tells us that our choice was determined by neuronal firings, which we don't identify with, then we say, well, it's deterministic choice as opposed to free-willed choice. So this distinction is always based on this notion of what do we identify with, and is our choice determined by something that belongs to what we identify with, or is it an external factor, something outside what we identify with? So that's the semantic basis of the distinction. But at the level of the universal mind, there is nothing outside of it. So the choices it makes are determined in the sense that the choices are determined by what the mind of nature is. Because the mind of nature is what it is. It chooses as it does. But that's not distinct from free will either, because there are no external forces from the point of view of the mind of nature. There is only the mind of nature. So what it must is what it desperately wills. And what it desperately wills is what it must. And there is no distinction between the two things. So the whole free will determinism discussion becomes a red herring at a universal level.
I have a question, not seeing anyone else, which is just, I'd be curious for your thoughts on, you speak to a lot of mystics, obviously Rupert and Christopher today, and people from non-dual traditions are attracted to your work, and you're obviously surrounded by many scientists, and just in the course of these meetings together, we've had Federico Fagin and Michael Levin and others. Do you have any intuitions on how this might continue to converge, and when or if there'll be value in more dialogues between people like Christopher and Michael Levin? Or I don't think it's something you're doing so much at Essential, or are you? Do you see your foundation moving in that direction, or culture moving in that direction?
Absolutely. I think there are dangers associated with it, but it is moving in a sort of a direction of synergies across fields, not even between science and philosophy alone, but across different fields of science. This week we have been, having the initial discussions about what kind of conference we want to do this year. And one of the possibilities, the one we are investigating more closely now, is a conference where we bring people from foundations of physics and people from the neuroscience of consciousness, and put them together in some small hotel up a mountain, isolated from the world, and let them hash it out together. Because there are many points of commonality, many points where these things touch on one another. In physics, because the last 45 years suggest very strongly through experiment that a non-contextuality is false. The idea that, physical things have absolute properties independent of perspective, because that seems not to be tenable anymore. It immediately points then to the subject. What is the role of the subject in the existence of physical reality? And that, of course, goes to neuroscience, because what is the subject? If the subject is more than just a physical system for which non-contextuality no longer applies, then what is it that gives rise to the physical world? We have to look at the neuroscience of consciousness. So these cross-disciplinary discussions, I think they will keep on increasing. Of course, there are pitfalls, because when you do that, people from either side of the discussion, there is a phase in which they think they have understood what the other side means, when in fact they haven't. And they may, and that misunderstanding can snowball. It may be a linguistic misunderstanding, it can be a more profound misunderstanding, but the illusion of knowledge is more dangerous than the lack of knowledge. So there will be a period in which these pitfalls will become painful, because more and more people will start falling for it. But the direction, I think you can extrapolate it fairly clearly from 2010, since neo-atheism began to wind down. Neo-atheism sort of peaked around the turn of the century, and then it began to wind down. At the same time, panpsychism began to ramp up, and now idealism, and now panpsychism is ramping down. I think what this is indicating is that physicalism or materialism is on the way out. I was talking to a very, very, very well-renowned scientist just yesterday here, because he's in another country. We're talking. I was sitting exactly where I am now, and he was saying exactly that. His perspective is the same. Physicalism is on the way out. It's not. Nobody's buying into it anymore. And what we need is some other metaphysics that doesn't part with some key epistemic values that we have, such as naturalism, such as some form of reductionism. Reductionism got a bad name recently because we misunderstand it. We think reductionism is about explaining the big in terms of the small. No, reductionism is explaining the complex in terms of the simpler. So if we understand this, you see that non-duality is the ultimate reductionism. It doesn't defy reductionism at all. On the contrary, it validates that much more. Reason, evidence. So if there is a metaphysics that fits with these epistemic values, and I would dare to say, any form of objective idealism does that, it will become the new one, because materialism is clearly on the way out, and historically there has never been an instance in history where we abandoned an older worldview and then stayed in a vacuum until another worldview came in. It never happens like this. You always have a direct replacement. We do not tolerate an epistemic vacuum. So the exit of physicalism is the entrance of objective idealism. And give it another 15 years, and this will be not only obvious, it will be, acknowledged. It's a matter of fact. So that's the direction it is going. And so there is some reason to feel hopeful in this regard. Psychologically, we have never, as a culture in the West, tolerated a vacuum of some positive statement about what reality is. We have never tolerated it. We always adopt the best hypothesis that we can conceive at a certain time. And then later on, that hypothesis turns out not to be tenable. And then we come up with the next best hypothesis. And then we believe it. Historically, it has proven impossible for us so far to withhold belief, to stay in that state of suspension, metaphysical suspension. From a social psychological perspective, it has never happened. So one could cynically say it's just from the level of culture, it's not something that's going to work. And then you might say, but some scientists are saying that we should just stick to neutral monism. There is even another variant called Mysterianism, which is even more neutral than neutral monism, because neutral monism is not as neutral as the name implies. Even though it doesn't make a positive assertion about what is, it does make two assertions about what it is not. It says that mind and matter are aspects of what is, and therefore mind and matter are not fundamental. So it makes two negative statements that aren't neutral at all. It says mind is not fundamental, it's reducible. Matter is not fundamental, it is reducible. There's nothing neutral about making these two negative statements. It's not merely a suspension of belief. It's an assertion of disbelief, a double one, a very active assertion of disbelief. So that's why there is Mysterianism, which is you suspend everything. But then again, historically, it never worked. So why are some people going for it, for Mysterianism and even some for neutral monism? The psychology here is that all these people are former physicalists. And although they are intellectually honest enough to accept that physicalism doesn't work, they don't want to concede the win to somebody else. You see? And therefore, the Mysterianism, and then we just don't know. If physicalism is not right, then we just don't know. Or we know it's not mind and it's not matter, but what it is, we don't know. So the psychology here is I concede that I didn't win, but I don't concede that you win. It's a draw. You see?
Can I just say that parenthetically, like, some neutral monists sort of say, okay, it's not mind or not matter, but there's this other kind of flavor of neutral monism, which is very humble, which is more like agnostic monism, which is, we don't know. And actually, it could turn out to be something pretty mind-like, or, whatever. But
okay. Then it's not neutral monism. Then it's just agnosticism. And then psychologically, it has never worked in the history of humankind, in the history of any culture, to be truly agnostic, to really suspend all beliefs and deal in terms of hypotheses. It has never worked. The human creature seems to need some kind of narrative in terms of which to relate to reality, some narrative that needs to be believed. Otherwise, it doesn't serve as a conduit to our emotional drives and our impetus to act and to do things. Would it be the most appropriate mental attitude to suspend all beliefs until we know better? Probably. But social psychologically speaking, not tenable, at least historically. History never showed us that this has ever worked. Now, the philosophical answer would be, and again, neutral monism, which is, now I understand, is not quite what you meant, but I'll stick to it because that's the recognizable alternative, neutral monism. It is not neutral. It makes two negative assertions. Whatever isn't mind or matter. It's something else. So it isn't neutral, and it isn't parsimonious, because there is a sense in which it's even worse than dualism, because dualism says, well, there are two things I experience, mind and matter. That's already wrong. You never experience matter. What you call matter is a mental process. The color red of an apple is a mental quality. The sweetness of a strawberry is a mental quality. We theoretically infer that those qualities of perception are modulated by something that is itself not qualitative. That's a theoretical inference. But okay, we are used to that theoretical inference. So the dualists stick to those. But a neutral monist would require even something extra, because it says it isn't either mind or matter. It's a third thing. So now we have to go beyond the given, which is mind, beyond the extra that we are used to some extra that we can't even conceive of. I think that's not parsimonious. I think it only complicates the game even more. But what you actually mean, which I now understand, is not neutral monism. It's a suspension of belief. It's just metaphysical agnosticism. That probably would...
But monist.
A monist metaphysical agnosticism. That probably is defendable. But psychologically, it's not going to work like that. I don't think so. It never worked like that in history. It would require a level of maturity from the human animal that I don't think it is there. It doesn't work at a cultural level. People need a story that they think this is the most likely, so I will live in terms of it. I will concede to you that it's not incoherent to think in terms of what you suggested, that if mind arises from something else, then mind can be a part of a spectrum of manifestation of that something else. It's not incoherent. My gut reaction to that would be, we don't need to go through this trouble. Why invent something other than mind if we can account for everything in terms of mental states? All we need to do is to recognize that some mental states are not ours. They are out there. The moment you do that, you can account for everything in terms of mental states. So the agnosticism seems to be an attempt to cure a problem that isn't really there. Because under analytic idealism, what is an experience? An experience is a pattern of excitation of the subject, the universal subject, which may be dissociated or not. So experiences are the notes, the musical notes of the guitar string. But what is the nature of that which gets excited? Now we can say whatever the nature of that is, it's intimately connected to experience, because experiences are excitations of the subject. And even the words subject and experience, they seem to relate very intimately. But of course, the question then arises, what is then the universal subject when it's not excited? When it's not excited, it's not an experience, because all experiences are excitations of the subject. A subject that is not excited is no experience, and yet it exists because it needs to exist so that every experience can exist. The problem, so by in saying that, I am sort of acknowledging that one direct implication of analytic idealism is that there must be an existence, not only a existence, it is the only existence that cannot be said to be restricted to an experiential state. And that's why I often use the word mental state, because you can still have a mind that doesn't experience, and that mind then consisting in the potentialities of experience. But when I do that, I am saying that ontologically then the mental and the experiential are connected so intimately that whatever difference there might be between them, it's irrelevant from all points of view. Now, why is it irrelevant from all points of view? Because of the following. Imagine that the mind of nature, the one subject that nature is, imagine that it's not dissociated. It is you, and it's not dissociated. It's only you. All your experiences, everything you can think, feel in terms of emotions, or perceive, if there is anything to perceive, which is yourself, are excitations of yourself. And if you're not excited, then there is no experience. What this means is that you fundamentally cannot know what you are beyond the experiences you have. You can only know yourself indirectly when you are excited. Then you become visible to yourself. You become experientiable to yourself. So this is a very fundamental unknowable. And if it is fundamentally unknowable, there's no point in talking about it. The only point there is to talk about experiences. And then we keep in the back of our minds that that which experiences is an eternal mystery to itself. It goes back to Gödel's incompleteness problem, the problem of self-reference. You cannot make statements about what the formal system itself is. It's the perennial cosmic itch, and it's fundamentally non-scratchable. And what this means is that it doesn't help anybody, and cannot ever help anyone, anything, to bring this problem forth, because it's an itch you can't scratch. So you might as well just talk in terms of mental states, keeping in mind that we may mean something slightly more about mental states than we mean about experiential states, but we are not quite sure whether this justifies an ontological distinction. Probably it doesn't, and then we just forget about it. Insofar as my fight today is to get rid of physicalism and have the Western culture, including science, adopt a form of objective idealism as the narrative that informs our lives, it is not constructive in the context of Western cultures to go to the level of subtlety that the Eastern mind has arrived at. And I don't mean by this to belittle the Western culture. That's my culture. It's where I come from. I'm a Westerner. But the Easterners had more time. They are older, and they've paid more attention through the years. So the level of nuance and sophistication that the Eastern mind has achieved makes it impossible for traditional Eastern cultures, because even India now is so westernized, but traditional Eastern cultures, insofar as they still survive, it's impossible for them to neglect the question you have brought up. For the much younger Western culture, about 1,000 years younger, it is impossible to bring this in and still have scientists being formed by a certain metaphysics, because the Western mind rebels against fundamental unknowables. There is this I'm drawing a blank now. This the Greek demigod who stole the fire from the gods, Prometheus. There is this Promethean archetype in the Western mind that we should never declare something unknowable. It may be unknown, but never unknowable. It's a naive idea. It fails to recognize our place in nature. Why would the cognitive system of hairless monkeys have evolved to, to make everything knowable in principle? It's ridiculous, but it's psychologically a very powerful archetype. So I never bring this up. And if I would bring this up with some big name scientists who are working with me now, they would just shrug and say, it doesn't help. It's not useful. Let's not go there. No, we can do all science without getting into this. Fundamental unknowables do not help anybody ever. So it will just add confusion. That's the Western disposition. It's to ignore that which cannot be put to good use. The Eastern disposition is completely different, which is I want to know what's true. And therefore I cannot voluntarily set aside a question that actually bothers me. It's a different perspective. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
What are your upcoming plans, your main projects that are?
I'm writing another book now. The Diamond and the Soul of the West is the new name. It used to be The Diamond and the Western Mind. I keep talking to an editor about it and switching the words. 3 chapters are fully written. There probably will be at least 8 chapters. So it's still in the beginning. I had originally hoped to complete it last year, but it was a very naive hope. There is a new book coming out at the end of October. I think so far it's the most important book I have written. It's not my personal favorite. My personal favorite is still More Than Allegory. But my judgment of what book is more important in terms of impact, I think Analytic Idealism in a nutshell is the more impactful book. I have reasons to think that because there are some scientists and scholars who have had it since summer last year. And I see that it does have an impact. It has a significant impact. So that's coming out in October. That's the new thing that will happen in the world. But for me, it's old news. It's written, it's done. I am now working on this book that has little to do with idealism, has little to do with analytic philosophy. It's a book of continental philosophy, akin to Nietzsche's Zarathustra. Of course, I'm not saying that it's as good as Nietzsche's Zarathustra, but the spirit of it is similar. It's akin to some works by Kierkegaard, very continental feeling tone to it. And as usual, it's not really written by Bernardo, but I'm not talking about channeling. I find that bad taste, it's not what's happening, but it's what nature is trying to say. Sometimes I read it and I'm like, oh God, did I write this? Don't recognize these words. What's going on here? It's very funny, but I got used to it because I have had this before. So that's the big thing in terms of my mental inner life. In terms of the outward work, Essential Foundation, books we are publishing, the events we are organizing, the videos we are making, our YouTube channel grew tremendously towards the end of last year. We got several million views in 3 months and a couple of million views in 3 months. And it was like, whoa, how did that happen? Now we slowed down because our director was moving houses. So the whole thing slowed down a little bit. But we are coming back online with new videos. So a lot of work to do there. And then there is some new science-oriented work I'm trying to do with some collaborators around IIT and Analytic Idealism. It's a more difficult part. It's the one part of my life now that I register as an effort. It's something, it requires effort and discipline. It's not something I am doing for the fun of it. Writing the book is also not for the fun of it, but it's effortless because it's not me doing it. I just have to say, okay, now I'm going to sit here and I'll put my hands there and let the thing happen. It doesn't entail much effort, but a model of dissociation under IIT, that's effort, that's intellectual effort. And so I do it because I think it needs to be done, not because I'm enjoying every second of it. And then there's my hobby. You know, I still build little computers, many of which are not, almost all of which are being sold now by two different companies. I don't make a single cent because I put the designs up online with an MIT license, which basically allows anyone to build and sell that stuff. And sure enough, there's a company in the EU and a company in the UK. Both are selling my stuff. Hopefully some deserving people are making money out of that. But I had a lot of fun building those computers, and people are making amazing things with those computers. I even put a section on the top menu of my website. I put a section there called computers, linking to another website of mine that was written under pseudonym, the Byte Attic. And then I figured, you know what, why will I keep it a secret? I would just put it in there so people know that I have a hobby too, and you know, meant for helping educate people, computer literacy. So yeah, that's fun. That's the fun part of my life. Yeah.
And again, just thank you so much, and thank you everyone for
Thanks
your
everybody.
questions and your attention and making it happen.
Very grateful to all of you. Have a good night.
Great. Good night.